Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and I'm really excited about this one.
Hey there. I am too. I mean, this is such a wild topic.
It really is. So we are setting a mission for you, the listener, today. We're going to dive into the incredible, really the lesser-known prequel to one of humanity's greatest achievements.
Yeah, we're using some great excerpts from the biography Who is Neil Armstrong by Roberta Edwards to sort of, unpack the life of the man behind that famous moonwalk.
Right. And to start, I want you to picture this. It is July 16th, 1969.
The big day.
The big day. It's a sweltering, 90-degree summer morning in Central Florida. The air is just incredibly thick with humidity.
And tension. I mean, the tension must have been unbelievable.
Absolutely. So Cape Kennedy is absolutely swarming. There are 1 million people who've camped out on beaches. They're crowding the highways.
It's a total circus.
Yeah. You have 2,000 reporters jockeying for position. You've got members of Congress, celebrities. Basically, the entire globe is holding its breath.
Yep.
But if you look closely, right in the middle of this deafening, massive crowd, there is this quiet, almost agonizingly intimate scene.
Yeah, his family.
Exactly. 2 young boys, 12-year-old Rick and 6-year-old Mark. And they are standing next to their nervous mother, Janet.
I can't even imagine what she was feeling.
I know, right? And they are staring up at this 30-story needle-like rocket because the commander locked inside the tiny capsule at the very top of that bomb. Well, it is a bomb, basically, is their dad.
And they know, just like everyone in Mission Control knows, that this morning is going to end in one of 2 ways.
Yeah.
It ends in the greatest historical triumph of the 20th century, or it ends in unspeakable tragedy.
Exactly. So the question we're asking today is, how do you engineer a human mind capable of sitting on top of the 30-story rocket without losing its absolute grip on reality?
Because that level of psychological resilience, it isn't something you're simply born with. It is forged.
Right.
It's the result of a very specific era and a sequence of really extreme, mechanical, and deeply traumatic experiences.
So before we can understand the man sitting in that capsule, we have to rewind. We need to go back to a time when flying machines were basically made of wood and cloth.
Yes, going back to 1930, the year Neil Armstrong was born in rural Ohio.
And his childhood was pretty unstable, right? He was a shy kid and his dad worked for the state government, so they moved a lot.
A lot. They moved 16 times before Neil even turned 13.
Wow, 16 times. That's tough for a kid.
Yeah. But amidst all that instability, he develops this singular obsession with flight. And you really have to contextualize what aviation was in the 1930s.
Right, it was still super new.
It was barely a generation old. Charles Lindbergh's famous solo flight across the Atlantic had happened just 3 years before Neil was born.
That's wild to think about.
It wasn't a polished industry yet. It was a wild, highly dangerous frontier.
So at age 6, he takes his very first airplane ride. And according to the biography, it was in a plane called the Tin Goose.
Yes, the Ford Trimotor. It was this early passenger plane with an aluminum body that rattled so violently, you basically had to shout to the person sitting right next to you.
Oh, man.
And it topped out at 100 miles an hour. Plus, the passengers sat on actual scratchy wicker seats that were just bolted to the floor.
Wait, wicker seats?
Yeah.
In a vibrating metal tube?
Exactly. His dad later admitted he was terrified the entire flight. But Neil was utterly captivated.
I love that. So he becomes an Eagle Scout and he starts building balsa wood model airplanes.
Mm.
But he doesn't just, put them on a shelf to look pretty.
No, not at all.
He builds a homemade wind tunnel in his basement. Wait, how was a kid in the 1940s even utilizing a wind tunnel?
It really shows you that he wasn't just a fan of airplanes, right? He was thinking like an aerodynamicist right from the start.
Yeah.
So a wind tunnel works on the principle of relative motion. Instead of an airplane moving through the air, you keep the airplane stationary and force air over it.
Okay, that makes sense.
So by putting a fan at one end of a tunnel and placing his balsa wood models inside, he could visibly observe how different wing shapes created lift, or, how certain designs created drag.
He was literally testing the physics of flight in his basement.
And he even used to deliberately launch his older models out of his second-story bedroom window.
Just to crash them.
Just to watch them crash on the driveway. He wanted to see how the structures failed upon impact.
That is so telling. But of course, playing with wood only satisfies you for so long, right?
Right.
He wanted to learn to fly real planes at the local airfield.
Right.
And to pay for those flying lessons, he gets a job at a local bakery.
And he didn't just work the cash register. He was hired for a very specific, highly physical task.
What was it?
Because of his small size, he was the only one who could physically climb inside the massive industrial dough mixer to scrape it clean.
Wait, literally inside the mixer?
Literally inside. He was baking over 1,300 donuts a night, covered in flour and grease, just to fund his airtime.
Okay, let's unpack this. He is doing manual labor, climbing inside an industrial machine in the middle of night, paying for his own flying lessons.
Yeah.
And he actually earns his pilot's license when he is 15 years old. He is legally flying an airplane before he is old enough to drive a car.
It's unbelievable.
To me, that is like, I don't know, qualifying for the Olympics before you've learned how to ride a bicycle. It shows this incredible, staggering level of focus.
And what's fascinating here is that this single-mindedness propelled him to Purdue University. He went on a Navy scholarship to study aeronautical engineering.
He wanted the math behind the machine.
Exactly. But, you know, the classroom only teaches you how the machine works. It doesn't teach you how your brain works when the machine fails.
Right. Which brings us to the crucible of his life, because that scholarship required Navy service. So in 1950, the Korean War breaks out, and Neil's studies are interrupted.
He's sent straight to the Pacific.
Yeah, he is just 20 years old flying Panther jets off this massive aircraft carrier, the USS Essex.
And this was incredibly dangerous combat flying. He was assigned to fly at extremely low altitudes, skimming the terrain.
Because he was bombing enemy bridges and railroads, right?
Yes, and scouting for targets. He flew 78 of these highly dangerous combat missions.
And on one of those low-level bombing runs, something happens that just completely defies my understanding of physics.
Oh, the cable incident.
Yes. The sources describe his jet being hit by anti-aircraft fire. The plane goes into this steep nosedive toward the ground. He pulls up, but as he clears the valley at about, 500 feet, his right wing is sheared off.
Completely sliced
off by a booby-trap cable that the enemy had strung across the valley, specifically to catch low-flying jets.
I mean, it's a catastrophic structural failure.
So how does a pilot even survive that? How do you fly a jet when half your lift is suddenly just gone?
It is an absolute aerodynamic nightmare.
I bet.
An airplane wing generates lift by creating higher pressure under the wing and lower pressure above it. So if you instantly lose half of your right wing, you lose asymmetrical lift.
Oh, wait.
The remaining left wing is still lifting, so the plane immediately wants to violently roll over to the right and enter in an unrecoverable death spiral.
So what on earth does he do in the cockpit?
He has to fundamentally fight the physics of his own aircraft. He has to smash the opposite rudder pedal and crank the control stick hard left just to use whatever aerodynamic surfaces he has left to counter that roll.
Wow.
But here's the real trick to generate enough lift from the broken wing. He has to fly fast. If he slows down to a normal landing speed, he just drops like a stone.
So he is hurtling a broken lopsided jet through the sky, knowing he can't slow down.
Exactly. He wrestled that damaged machine all the way back to friendly territory, out over the ocean, and then he ejected.
And he survived.
Barely. His parachute opened, he landed in a rice paddy, and actually cracked his tailbone.
He cracked his tailbone, but he lived. Now, here's the part that genuinely stops me in my tracks.
Yeah.
Just 48 hours later, 2 days after having his wing sliced off, fighting a death spiral, and ejecting into a swamp, he is back on the USS Essex.
Getting right back into a cockpit.
Yes.
Yeah.
To fly again. I mean, we often romanticize military pilots as having, nerves of steel, but that just feels so inadequate here. What is actually happening in someone's brain to allow them to do that?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the exact psychological architecture NASA would later hunt for.
Right?
It's not about being fearless. Fear is a biological imperative. It is about total compartmentalization.
What do you mean?
Think of the human brain like a computer processor. When an average person faces imminent death, their brain opens a dozen background applications. Panic, thoughts of family, adrenaline shakes, existential dread.
And those apps crash the system.
Exactly. The brain just freezes. But Neil Armstrong had this ability to instantly force quit every emotional background application.
Well,
When that wing sheared off, he allocated 100% of his cognitive processing power to geometry, aerodynamics, and problem solving. And once the problem was solved, he simply rebooted and went back to work.
that is just ice in the veins. Unbelievable.
Truly.
So he survives Korea, he finishes his degree at Purdue, gets married to his wife, Jan, and transitions into a totally new career as an experimental test pilot.
Pushing the absolute physical limits of aircraft.
Yeah, they move out to this tiny cabin in the Mojave Desert near Edwards Air Force Base. And by the way, the source mentions this cabin had no hot water.
Oh, roughing it.
Seriously. And this is where he tests the X-15.
Now, the X-15 is a legendary machine. It wasn't just a fast airplane. It was literally a rocket with wings.
Right.
It could reach speeds of 4,000 miles an hour and fly at an altitude of 50 miles. That is the very edge of outer space.
But the source notes something really weird about the X-15. It didn't take off from a runway.
No, it did.
It had to be carried up into the sky while attached to the wing of a massive B-52 bomber and then dropped from midair. Why couldn't it just take off like a normal jet?
It really comes down to atmospheric density and fuel consumption. The atmosphere at sea level is incredibly thick, aerodynamically speaking. It's like soup. Rocket engines burn through their fuel supply in a matter of minutes. So if the X-15 tried to blast its way through the thickest part of the atmosphere from the ground, it would run out of fuel long before it ever reached its target altitude. By carrying it up to 45,000 feet and dropping it, you bypass all that dense lower atmosphere.
He is literally being dropped out of the sky in a rocket to brush up against the blackness of space.
Just incredible.
He is living the absolute pinnacle of this high adrenaline engineering-focused life.
Yeah.
But then, and this is where the story shifts, an unspeakable personal tragedy hits.
Yeah. Neil and Jan had a son, Rick, and a little 2-year-old daughter named Karen, who Neil called Muffy. And in 1961, Muffy tripped and fell on the sidewalk. It seemed like a totally normal toddler fall, but soon her eyes started crossing and she lost her balance.
Oh, no.
The doctors discovered a tumor deep in her brainstem.
And despite the absolute best medical treatments of the era, the tumor was aggressive. Muffy passed away on a Sunday morning in January of 1962.
It's just devastating.
It is. And the biography notes that people who knew the Armstrongs said they visibly aged overnight. But what I find so incredible and heartbreaking is how Neil reacted.
He was completely silent about it.
He didn't talk about it at all. He never spoke of her death to his colleagues. People who met him years later didn't even know he had lost a child.
Right.
And just a few months later, he makes this massive pivot. He decides to apply to NASA's astronaut program. And his application actually arrived a week past the deadline, but NASA quietly slipped it into the pile anyway.
Which really raises an important question about his psychological state at that time.
I mean, I have to point this out, honestly. A few months after your toddler dies, you apply to sit on top of experimental rockets. Is that healthy compartmentalization, or is that a man desperately running away from his own grief?
It's a profound question, and I think it requires looking at the nature of the job he chose.
Okay.
As a test pilot in the X-15, Neil was the ultimate solo operator. His hands were on the stick. If he lived or died, it was entirely up to his own skill. But the early astronaut program, that was a complete inversion of control.
Because astronauts in those early capsules were essentially just passengers.
Exactly. They called them spam in a can back then.
Right.
The engineers down in Houston controlled the trajectory. The automatic computers ran the burns. Neil was surrendering control.
That's a huge shift.
It is. It's highly probable that the trauma of losing his daughter, which was a situation where he was utterly powerless against a biological reality, broke something in him. He might have sought out an environment, like the infinite void of space, that was as harsh and unyielding as his internal grief. He needed a challenge so monumentally difficult that it would consume all of his processing power, leaving no room for the pain he just couldn't verbalize.
Wow. He needed the math to save him from the silence.
Well said.
So he is accepted into the second group of astronauts in September 1962, and the family moves to Texas. But this isn't the finish line, right?
Not at all.
It is the starting gun of this space race. Getting accepted was just the entry point into this intense pressure cooker of the Cold War.
The geopolitical context of the 1960s was incredibly intense. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in the Cold War, and the Soviets were, frankly, humiliating the Americans in space.
They were beating them at every turn.
Right. They launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, then Sputnik 2 with Laika the dog. And in 1961, they put the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space.
The U.S. was visibly losing the ultimate proxy war. So President John F. Kennedy draws a line in the sand. He issues his famous mandate. Put a man on the moon and bring him safely back before the decade is out, so before 1970.
And NASA needed a very specific physiological prototype to pull this off. You had to be under 35 in perfect health, and you had to be under 6 feet tall.
Which sounds strange until you realize those early capsules were essentially the size of a telephone booth.
Exactly. You had to be compact. And Neil fit those strict parameters perfectly. But the training regimen NASA designed for these men was bizarre, brutal, and really bordering on torture.
Yeah.
They had to account for every conceivable edge case disaster.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The engineers realized, well, what if the capsule returns from the moon, misses its splashdown target in the ocean, and crashes into a dense jungle?
A totally valid fear.
So NASA literally drops Neil Armstrong into the steamy rainforests of Panama with a survival kit. He has a tiny tent, a machete, and he's learning how to scavenge for roots and eat bugs to survive.
Just in case.
Eating bugs in the jungle.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also had to train their inner ears and bodies for zero gravity.
Yes, using a heavily modified cargo plane, known colloquially as the Vomit Comet.
Okay, so how does an airplane actually simulate outer space?
By using parabolic flight, the plane climbs at an incredibly steep 45-degree angle up to about 30,000 feet.
Okay.
And then the pilot violently pushes the nose down into a steep dive. As the plane crests the top of that invisible roller coaster and begins to fall toward the Earth, it is falling at the exact same rate as gravity is pulling the people inside it.
So they aren't actually floating, they're just falling the same speed as the floor beneath them.
Precisely. For about 30 seconds, they experience weightlessness. But then the plane pulls up hard, subjecting them to twice the force of normal gravity. And they did this dozens of times a day.
I see why they called it the Vomit Comet. But, we have this culturally sanitized image of astronauts in crisp, pristine white suits floating peacefully in sterile environments.
Very glamorous.
Right. But Neil's reality during the 1960s was chaotic, filthy, and constantly exploding. Like, his house in Texas literally caught on fire in the middle of the night. He barely got his family out.
It was a chaotic time.
And the missions themselves were incredibly fragile. I mean, look at Gemini 8.
Gemini 8 was Neil's first time in space in 1966. He was the commander. He successfully docked his capsule with an unmanned target vehicle in orbit, which was a massive achievement.
Unprecedented.
But shortly after, the docked spacecrafts began to roll wildly out of control.
And it wasn't just a slow drift, right? A thruster had short-circuited. It was continuously firing. In the atmosphere, air resistance creates friction that limits how fast you can spin.
Okay.
In the vacuum of space.
There is zero friction. The law of conservation of angular momentum means that with a thruster constantly pushing, the spin just accelerates indefinitely.
Oh, man.
They were spinning at a rate of 1 full revolution per second. The centrifugal force was pushing the blood to the extremities of their bodies. Their vision was blurring. They were seconds away from blacking out, which would mean certain death.
So how did he stop it?
This is where that Korean War compartmentalization saved his life. While being violently thrown around the capsule fighting gray out, Neil manually overrode the automatic system.
He just took control.
He realized the short circuit was in his own capsule, so he undocked from the target vehicle. And here's the catch that actually made them spin faster, because they lost the mass of the other ship.
Oh, physics is just cruel sometimes.
Seriously. So Neil made a split-second, incredibly risky decision. He deactivated the primary orbital thrusters entirely.
Okay.
And he activated the re-entry thrusters, the ones strictly reserved for coming home, and fired them manually using his hand controller to counter the spin.
Wow.
He stabilized the craft, but because he had dipped into the re-entry fuel, mission rules dictated an immediate emergency abort.
So they splashed down in the Pacific. And Neil actually fell into a brief depression after that because he worried NASA would blame him for the failure.
Even though he saved them.
Right. The data proved his quick thinking saved a doomed mission. But the hardware failures didn't end in orbit. Back on Earth, he was training in a machine called the LLRV, or the Flying Bedstead.
The lunar landing simulator? Because there's no atmosphere on the moon, a winged glider won't work. A lunar lander has to be lowered purely by rocket thrust.
And this thing looked ridiculous, right?
Oh, the flying bedstead looked like a tangle of metal pipes and jet engines designed to mimic that thrust vectoring.
And while Neil is hovering it a couple hundred feet off the ground, the propellant system fails. The machine wildly rolls over.
Another roll.
Neil ejects, his parachute opens, and he lands in the dirt, just mere seconds before the machine smashes into the runway and explodes in a massive fireball.
He was seconds away from burning alive.
What's fascinating here is how NASA viewed these near-death experiences. The engineers who built the simulators intentionally designed them to fail.
They were merciless.
They would quietly inject software errors and shut down vital systems while Neil was flying the simulator.
Why intentionally break the machine?
Because NASA knew the cold, hard truth. The technology they were sending to the moon was fundamentally fragile.
Oh, for sure. The computers had less processing power than a modern digital watch.
Right, they couldn't make the hardware perfect. So their solution was to make the human unbreakable. They subjected Neil to so much artificial disaster that by the time he faced a real crisis, 240,000 miles away from Earth, his heart rate barely spiked.
That is just incredible context.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? When we look back at that sweltering July morning in 1969, with the million people cheering and the two little boys watching their dad on top of that Saturn V rocket, it is incredibly easy to focus only on the glorious outcome.
Of course. We love the parade. We love the photograph or the boot print in the gray dust. The triumph is always what makes the history books.
But the architecture of that triumph is built on a foundation of deeply unglamorous, often painful dedication. It's built by the kid scraping dough out of an industrial mixer at 3 a.m. It's built by the 20-year-old who yanks a broken jet out of a death spiral and flies again 2 days later.
And it's built by a father turning the silent, unspeakable grief of losing his child into an unwavering focus on the cosmos.
Beautifully said. Success is surviving the fiery failures, eating the bugs in the jungle, and pushing through the merciless simulations over and over again.
The visible leap for mankind really required a lifetime of invisible, agonizing steps.
It really did. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. Think back to the era Neil was born into. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew the very first powered airplane.
Right, at Kitty Hawk?
Yep. That flight lasted exactly 12 seconds. It traveled 120 feet. It was flimsy, erratic, and practically dragged on the sand.
Very true.
Neil Armstrong was born just 27 years after that tiny, flimsy flight. And less than 40 years later, he was stepping onto the surface of the moon.
That timeline is just bonkers.
The timeline of human progress is not linear. It is exponential once the foundation is poured. So look around you today. What fragile 12-second experiment is happening right now in a lab or a garage or a simulator that seems totally insignificant, but will completely redefine what is possible for our species in just a few decades?
What is today's canvas and wood that will take us to the next world?
Exactly. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.